This conference will now be recorded.
In yesterday's session, we were discussing about what is EKS cluster and how EKS cluster will work, how to create a node groups to the EKS cluster. I hope everyone is able to set up the EKS cluster. Did you guys able to set up EKS cluster? Are you guys able to start deploying the applications in EKS cluster? Okay, good. Guys, try to practice as much as possible. As I already told many times, we told from day one, the recordings will work for 90 days from the day of session. So when the recordings are available and working, try to go through multiple times, like 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and try to practice so that you will become an expert in that, any topic which we are discussing here. So practice is very, very important. Right? Now, yesterday we created a EKS cluster. Now, as of now, when I created a EKS cluster, I created a node group. I have one EKS cluster, Elastic Kubernetes Service. That cluster has one node group. While creating the node group, minimum size I have given as 2, maximum size I have given as 5, but the desired size I have given as 3. So currently, how many servers are there? Workers are there for that group, node group, because this desired size is 3. Now let's say if I try to edit and if I change the desired size to 2, now how many nodes will I will have? Now I change the desired size as 2. Minimum size 2, desired size 2, maximum size 5. Now I will have how many nodes? Now, as of now, I have 3 and I have updated to desired to 2. So does that the additional server gets terminated? Yes. Let me show you. Let me show you. Let me connect to my Kubernetes, that client machine. Wherever I have configured my kubectl, let me connect to that client machine. Now this is my Kubernetes client machine. This is my Kubernetes client machine where I have a kubectl installed. Kubectl get nodes. Now first, if you see, it is intelligently terminating. First, is it marking what that node, that access node is disabled for scheduling? I mean to say, is that EKS has already added that unschedulable as true? Is that marked first as true on one node? Now, does any new parts get scheduled in this node because this is marked as unschedulable? No. After some time, is that node gets terminated because the desired is 2? Currently there are 3. After some time, is this node gets terminated automatically? Yes. But who is doing that? Is Kubernetes is doing? Is AWS is doing that, terminating the additional server? AWS. So Kubernetes will just manage the Kubernetes resources like pods, deployment, services, config maps, secrets, network policies, volume claims, stateful sets, replica sets. It will manage Kubernetes resources. Does AWS will manage AWS resources like a servers, load balancers, EBS storages, all those things? Yes. Now here, when I am using managed Kubernetes cluster, when I am using managed Kubernetes cluster like EKS, In the Kubernetes architecture, there is no difference, but will I have some additional controller? The way we have a node controller, replication controller, endpoint controller, do I have an additional controller called cloud controller? Cloud controller? Yes. So I will have some additional component when I am using a managed Kubernetes cluster. When I am using a managed Kubernetes cluster like EKS, AKS, or GKE, you have a API server, you have a scheduler, you have a control manager. We will have one cloud control manager. We will have one cloud control manager. What exactly that cloud control manager does? Is it going to interact with cloud, respective cloud provider to manage AWS resources, like creating a EBS volumes whenever we are requesting volumes, creating a load balancer in the cloud, whenever I am creating a service of type load balancer? Is that cloud control manager will communicate with cloud? That is the additional controller. That is the additional controller which gets created in the managed Kubernetes cluster. In the managed Kubernetes cluster, you have a additional components here. Is that kind of a cloud control manager? Is it going to communicate with cloud provided APIs to create a load balancers, that external load balancer, creating a EBS volumes whenever you are using EBS provisioner storage class? Yes. So that is how it is interacting with cloud. It is interacting with cloud. Now we have a cloud control manager also running as part of the managed Kubernetes cluster, along with node control manager, service endpoint control manager, replication control manager. Like that, you have a cloud control manager also. That cloud control manager is going to communicate with cloud provided APIs to manage the or provision the cloud resources like load balancers and EBS volumes and all those things. Now I have only two nodes now. I deployed one application. I deployed one application. This application is running in those nodes, those pods, right? Those pods are running in these nodes. Now I want to access this application. Can I create a service? Can I create a service now to access this application? Now, since it's a managed Kubernetes clusters, it has a capabilities to interact with cloud APIs and provision the load balancers in the cloud. Can I create a service of type load balancer here in this cluster? Yes. Now, let me do that. I'm going to create a service. I'm going to create a service. I'm going to create a service API version v1 kind service. Metadata. Metadata. Name of the service. Any name. Java web app SVC like this. Spec. Since my deployment is also in a default namespace, I am not giving the namespace for this service also. Service also gets created in the same namespace. The service type, what I am saying, the service type, what I am saying load balancer. This is external load balancer, which will provisioned in the cloud. Selector, same concept. What is my selectors for this service? Whatever labels I have for my pod. Whatever labels I have for my pod. Right? These are my pod labels. These are my pod labels. So I'm giving those as a selectors. Now ports, ports, target port 80. This is load balancing port as well as service port now. Load balancing port as well as service port. Now target port. What is my target port? Now this is 80, 80. Before I create a service here, if you see kubectl get all. Do I have any service in this namespace for that application before I create? No. Now let me go to the cloud also. Let me go to the cloud also. Here, let me go to the load balancer section. Let me go to the load balancer section. Here, this is for a different purpose, guys. This is for a different purpose. I created this load balancer for different application basically. I was teaching AWS for morning batch. Today also this was going on. So I created a load balancer in AWS manually, and I was explaining AWS concepts. So that is different load balancer. Now when I create a service now, am I going to get a load balancer? When I say kubectl apply, am I going to get one load balancer in the cloud automatically? When I apply this one, kubectl apply. Now you see here, kubectl get all our service. Now, do I have one service? Do I have one service called Java Web App SVC? What type of service it is? Load balancer. What is this? What is this? That is service IP, cluster IP. Service IP, cluster IP. So within the cluster, one microservice want to communicate with other microservice, they can still use this service name, guys. Suppose one more API, one more application you deployed, that microservice has to communicate with this microservice. Still, can they use this service name within the cluster? If one application has to communicate with other application within the cluster, can they still use this name? If the application is in different namespace, then can I use FQDN within the cluster? Can I use FQDN of this service? Now, external traffic, if I want to access from outside, external traffic has to reach this application, then can I use this external IP? From outside the cluster, if I want to reach, now can I use this one? External IP, that external IP is nothing but what here? If you go and see in the load balancing now, if I go and see in the load balancing now, do I see one load balancer here? Can I see with same name A823E? Can I see one load balancer here? So this load balancer, what type of load balancer it has created by that Kubernetes EKS? What type of load balancer it has created? We have a classic application network. It has created a classic load balancer. Now, is this load balancer has a listener? We discussed AWS concept. Is this load balancer has a listener? On what port load balancer is listening? This external load balancer, port 80. And the moment request goes to load balancer on port 80, to which instance port it is forwarding? What is this instance port here? Can I consider this as a node port? Can I consider the node port service 31463? So 31463, this one, is it a node port? Load balancer created with listener. Request comes to load balancer on port 80. It will forward the traffic on 31463. It is like a TCP layer 4 load balancer. TCP protocol layer 4 load balancer. Port 80, it will forward the traffic to 31463. To which instance it will forward? Here, can I see some instances here? It is forwarding the traffic on this port. To which instances it is going to forward? Is it forwarding the traffic to these two instances? What is these two instances? What is these two instances? Is these two instances are my Kubernetes nodes, worker nodes? Worker nodes. Now, if I access this one from outside, do I need to use node IPs and node ports as an end user? Do I need to use node IPs and node ports? No. And on which port this load balancer created? Load balancer port is also 80. Now his request is going to load balancer. His load balancer is forwarding the traffic to Kubernetes node IP and node port. from that node IP to node port, is it forwarding the traffic to pod? Is this happening now? One second. Is happening now? So I am one customer, one user. Am I using this load balancer here in my system? Yes. Is request is going to load balancer? That load balancer? Yes. Is that load balancer is forwarding the traffic? Load balancer is accepting the traffic on port 80. Is it forwarding the traffic to that node IPs and node ports in the background? That Kubernetes nodes on node IP and node port? Yes. Once it is reaching that node IP and node port, is that request is forwarded to cluster IP, from node IP to cluster IP, from cluster IP to any one of the pod IP? Request is going to node to the service, that cluster service to the pod. Now, can I consider this as an external load balancer? External load balancer available for external customers. Can I consider this as an internal load balancer available within the cluster? Any application within the cluster want to communicate, do they need to use this one? Do they need to request via this one? External IP is not required. You no need to go outside the traffic, outside the cluster. Internally, one application can communicate with other application with this one. But external customers, can they use this external load balancer like end users? Yes. So request is coming to load balancer to the nodes to the service to the pods. Now, my application context is this. My application context is this. Am I able to access that application via that load balancer? Now, is this application running as a pod in my Kubernetes cluster, or is this application running in a virtualized deployment in a virtual machine directly? Is this application running as a pod container? It is running as a container within the pod. It is running as a container within the pod. I am not doing virtualized deployment. Now, am I able to access this application? And again, if required, can I map this load balancer with the DNS actual domain, because this is kind of a AWS provided domain name, which is not user friendly. Now, if I already have a domain, can I go and create a records in Route 53 and map this load balancer with that domain? As I already told in AWS itself, if you don't have a domain, you don't want to purchase the domain, then how can you at least practice? If you want to feel you are using a domain, using your local laptop, host file. I can get the IP of this domain by executing some kind of a ns lookup command. I can execute ns lookup on this name, load balancer name, ns lookup on this. If ns lookup is not there, let me install ns lookup. It is in bind utils package, I think. Bind utils or bind tools. So let's see. I install that package. That package has ns lookup software binary. Now I can get IP, any one of the IP. Can I map that IP with some name like this? Just you want to feel you are using a domain Java web app dot, let's say, something like this, mithuntech.com like this. Can I map like this locally in my local laptop? If you guys are using Windows system, Windows laptops, Windows desktop, where do you have a host file in Windows? Where do you have a host file in your Windows laptop if you are using Windows laptops or Windows desktops? Well, you guys practiced AWS. I think you have done. Did did you guys practice these things when I am discussing in AWS? This is nothing to do with Kubernetes. We already discussed. We already discussed. We already discussed this in AWS. If you are using Windows laptop, where do you have a host file? Krishna Prasad is saying certificate manager. Huh? There is nothing called certificate manager here. In C system 32, C system 32 drivers etc host file. Since I am using MacBook, this is my local laptop. This is my local laptop. Since I am using MacBook, Mac is built on top of Linux only. So I have my host file in my laptop in this location. Now here, I can do something like this. Let's say that load balancer IP, that load balancer IP, whatever load balancer I got, that load balancer IP, I can map something like this, some kind of a meaningful name. But as I already discussed many times in the AWS, in real time, does applications will ask every customer, every users to have the entries like this in their host file? No. So now I have done locally. I have done locally when I say java webapp.mithuntech.com, and if I access that application context, I can access. But does this will work for you? Does this will work for you when you guys are accessing? No. So instead of doing it locally, if I have a valid domain, if I have a valid domain, will I able to map this domain with that load balancer in my DNS configurations? But is it anything to do with the Docker or Kubernetes here, that DNS and mapping the DNS with your load balancers? No, it is a different topic, which we have already discussed, when we are discussing AWS. Now, I already have a hosted zone. I already have a hosted zone created, which we already discussed all these things in AWS itself. Let me go to Route 53. Let me go to Route 53. I already have a domain. I already created a hosted zone. Now, can I create a alias record, a record in this hosted zone for that domain, whatever domain I have? I can map the domain with that load balancer. I already created a lot of things here. Let me terminate all these things. Or maybe let me do this. Where is that? This one, java web app.mithuntechdevops.co.in. Now can I map to that load balancer, whatever load balancer I got now? I think this one, that classic load balancer for the domain. Now, if I access something like this, java web app.mithuntechdevops.co.in, is it resolving to that load balancer in the DNS, and is it routing the traffic to that load balancer to the Kubernetes nodes IP node port, then service to your pods? Now, do you guys also able to access? Because this is a global DNS, I have a valid domain, I created an entry, you guys also able to access. Now, the guys who are accessing, can we consider them as the end users for that application? Like you guys are accessing this application, can we consider you are a end users of that application? I am the owner of this application who is developing, who is deploying and managing that application. Can I consider as a owner, or application owner, or application developer? That company, not me, that company. So is this application hosted somewhere in the world instead of their own data center, instead of my own data center? Did I hosted my application in AWS like a cloud infrastructure? And again, instead of doing a virtualized deployment, am I creating my applications as a containers, and am I using Kubernetes to manage those containers in Kubernetes pods? Now you can relate to actual applications also. You can relate this to actual applications also. Whatever applications you are working or you are using, now will you able to relate what is server, what is storage, what is load balancer, what is network, and also that applications can be run in a virtualized deployment directly in the virtual machines. But as I already told multiple times, is virtual machines are heavyweight. Virtual machines will take lot of time to boot up. Will I able to utilize my resources more efficiently when I am using virtual machines? No. Instead of virtualized deployment, can I go with a containerized deployment by creating my applications as a containers? And I can, is it possible to isolate? Is it possible to deploy multiple containers in a same server? Yes. Now instead of directly creating a servers, because instead of directly creating a containers, containers will not be recreated or rescheduled if something went wrong. Are we using some kind of a orchestration tool to manage those containers, load balance those containers, scale the containers like Docker Swarm? Now, which platform I am using to deploy my containers and scale the containers and manage the containers and load balance the containers? Kubernetes. So if you want to use Kubernetes, do you need to be familiar with whatever topics we discussed so far, like a pod, service, deployment, replica set, replication controller, stateful set, config map, secrets, volumes, network policies, taints, tolerations, node selector, node affinity, HPA. Based on the requirement, do you need to leverage all those concepts? Suppose you have a requirement to deploy your application as a deployment with HPA, all these things you need to be familiar. I hope at least you are familiar, got a clear picture of what is application, what is infrastructure, what do you mean by container, what do you mean by server, what do you mean by network, what do you mean by storage, what do you mean by container, all these things, how it works in the background. As I told multiple times, is it mandatory to deploy applications as a containers? Is it mandatory to use Docker, Kubernetes, or Docker Swarm? No. Can I do in a traditional deployment? Can I do it in a virtualized deployment? Also, if required. And also, is it mandatory to use? Is it mandatory to use AWS or Azure or GCP? Can't I do this one in a my own data centers also, if required, on premise? Yes. But if it is on-premise, you know the challenges. If it is on-premise, you know the challenges. We discussed the challenges or problems with on-premise data centers when we discussed about AWS. So you need to understand the concept so that you can understand your application, architecture, your operations, DevOps concepts easily. So based upon the requirement, you can use any of these concepts. Now, I am able to access my application. Now, similarly, will I able to deploy one more application also? Now here another application also if required, that can be Node.js application, that can be Python application, whatever it is, that can be another Java application, another Java microservice or Python microservice or Node.js application. Yes. Now let me demonstrate. Let me demonstrate. So let me create a maybe deployment. Why I don't have that plugin? I think I have uninstalled that plugin. That Kubernetes plugin. I think it is not installed. Hmm. Okay, I think I have uninstalled that plugin. That plugin is not there. Let me go to extensions. Kubernetes plugin. That plugin is not there, it seems. I hope this one, but why it is not auto populating? I have this plugin. Okay, let's see. Okay, that is fine. At least I can copy paste. Okay. Now I want to deploy another application, another microservice. I'm trying to deploy another application. Now, can I create a deployment and services if required config map, secrets, HPA, whatever that application is expecting to create? Can I create a deployment, HPA, config map, secrets, whatever that application is expected to create in the Kubernetes? Can I create all the Kubernetes resources, whatever is required for that application, config map, secrets, all those things. Now I want to create two replicas, labels, whatever labels you want to have for that application. Whatever you want to have. Now can I create from that respective image? I think that port is 5000. I need to know the image. What is my image? I don't know that registry detail. Without image, that is not possible because you are creating a pod will have a containers. That container has to be created using image. So now, as of now, in which registry I have that image? That is in the Docker Hub public registry. That is in the Docker Hub public registry. I will use that image, this image. Now I have a lot of tags also. I have this one also. I can use this image, registry, repository, and tag. On which port that image is running? I think it is running on 5000. If I am not wrong, that Python application is running on 5000. Now can I create a service? Something like this, target port 5000. Now label that Python app, service of type load balancer. Now, if I want to deploy this in a different namespace also, is it possible for me to deploy this in a different namespace by creating a namespace in this cluster? By creating a namespace in this cluster, I can define. But if you see, do I need to improve this one? Do I need to improve this manifest? Which means, do I need to follow some best practices? What is missing here? It is not mandatory, but it is good to use. What is missing here? Do I need to define resource request and limits? Resource request and limits. At the same time, is it recommended to have a liveness probe and readiness probe also to check the health of the application? So all these things are improvements or best practices which you need to use. Now, if this application container is expected to pass some environment variables also, is it possible for me to create a config map or secret and refer those config map and secrets in this container environment variables if it is expecting? Otherwise, if it is expecting to pass configurations as a files, like a property file, XML file, can I use config map as a value? Can I create a config map with that file content and can I mount that file with this pod container? config map as a values. That is again based on the requirement. And if this is a stateful application, do I need to use volumes also, persistent volumes also, PVC, persistent volume claims? That is, everything is based on the requirement. So based on the requirement, do you need to use all those things in your Kubernetes while deploying your applications like config map, secrets, volumes, services, network policies, all these things? Yes. And again, if you have a requirement, this part should get scheduled in so and so node, specific nodes. Can I use that scheduling concept, node selector, node affinity, or pod affinity, pod anti affinity, taints, tolerations, all those things based on the requirement? Yes. So that is, everything depends on the requirement. Now let me deploy this one. Let's say I don't want any downtime here. So can I follow this rolling update strategy? Or blue-green deployments also if required, canary deployments if required. Yes. Now let me create a deployment. Let me create a deployment. kubectl apply -f that Python. Now if you see, do I have a two more parts getting created? I have another deployment, this Python application deployment. This deployment has internally created this replica set. That replica set is creating the parts. Parts are coming up, and there is a service. Now if you see, do I have one more load balancer? Do I have one more load balancer got created here? Do I have one more load balancer got created here for that application? Now when I access via this load balancer, am I going to get a response from that other application, that Python application? It is still not ready. That is still not ready, because when you go to load balancing, it is still coming up. That load balancer is still coming up. That load balancer is still coming up. Do you see? Is that getting load balancer? Now this load balancer is listening on port 80. It is routing the traffic to this instance port 3228. So his request is going to this port. Is that processed by this service? Request goes to that node IP and that port, that will be processed by this service. Service to these ports. Service to these ports. Now am I able to access that other application which is running in the Kubernetes cluster? Something is running on the root context itself, that Python application running something on the root context itself. Now can I see that response? I think there are some APIs also. Something like is there. If you see, there are some REST APIs. Am I getting some response like this? REST APIs also. Now this is also working. Now if required, can I map this one with another domain, or another domain also if required in the DNS? Yes, that is how it is working. Now let's understand one more concept here, the scaling. Kubernetes, is it possible for me to scale the pods automatically using HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler, based on the load on the pods, based on the load on the containers? Is it possible for me to scale using HPA? Yes. Now whether you are manually scaling, whether you are automatically scaling, that doesn't matter. Now let me use this one. Now I will define some resources here. Resource request and limits. I'll define some resource request and limits here. resources, requests, and we have a limits. Now, based on the requirement on that application, on that container, can I say how much CPU I need? Let's say I'm saying 500 millicore CPU, memory, memory. Can I say 1 GB if required? Limits. Maximum it can go, maximum it can go CPU, maybe 1 CPU. Memory, can I say 2 GB, 4 GB based on the requirement of that application on that container? Maybe 2 GB, 1 GB like this. Now I am defining a resources. Now there is no HPA as of now, but let me apply this one. Now there is a resource request and limits. There is resource request and limits. Since there is a change, since there is a change in my pod spec, even though image version is not changed, since there is a change in the pod spec, am I get a new pods, and is it terminating old pods? And even though the deployment is happening, do I still have, will I able to still access that application? Even though the deployment is going on, am I able to still access that application? No downtime. And one more important thing, is it recommended to have this liveness probe and readiness probe also? Because if something is wrong, even though your pods are running, I want to check the health on my application. Can I define liveness probe, readiness probe also here? Liveness probe, the health checks, the way we have already verified. This liveness probes, readiness probes, we already used all these things. Something like this. Something like this. Liveness probe, readiness probe. I'm just copy pasting. I don't want to waste much time. In detail, we discussed all these things. Like this is the health of my application on port 80, initial delay seconds, period seconds, like every 10 seconds if you want to follow all these things. Now, is it going to perform the health on the application unless until your pod is ready? Your readiness probe is successful. Unless until your pod is ready, your readiness probe is successful. Does that pod will reflected in your service endpoints? If readiness probe is failed, do you think that pod gets added to the service? No. If readiness probe is failed, the service will not have that endpoint. That service will not have that endpoint. Now, if liveness probe is failed, is it going to restart your pod container? That container, is it going to restart that container? Yes. Now, if you see, now again, I have done the changes. Now, even though it is running, is it reflected in your service endpoints? Is it reflected in your service endpoints? In this one, it is still showing only old one. Unless until this becomes ready, does this old part gets terminated? No. But still, is my application down? Am I able to still access my application? Because I have one old pod, that will be terminated once this becomes ready. If this doesn't becomes ready, is that old pod will get terminated? No. So this way, will I able to achieve zero downtime deployments also? Even though I am doing some background, I am updating my application. Suppose I have a CI/CD in place. You are the customer. You are the end user. You are accessing application like this. Now in the background, if I have a CI/CD pipeline in place, whenever developers are modifying the code, so is that pipeline can take, is that So if I have a CI/CD in place, then whenever developer modify the code, does Jenkins will be able to take that code, compile the code, run the unit test cases, run the sonar scans, and build an application package, build a Docker image, and push the Docker image to the registries. And using this Kubernetes manifest, does Jenkins can connect and apply those deployments? So in the background, CI/CD can happen. At the same time, end users can access the application without downtime. This way, you can leverage your Kubernetes concepts here. Now, if you see, these pods are ready. So it has terminated the old pods. It has terminated the old pods. Now I can see only those two new pod details here. All these things you can follow. Now if I want to scale my pods automatically, whenever there is a load on these pods containers, what needs to be created if required? What is the other object which I need to create? Can I create a HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler, for this? Yes. Now, even though you have a HPA, HPA is scaling your pods. What if you don't have enough CPU, enough memory available in the cluster, in the nodes? Do you think your pods get scheduled? HPA will just scale your pods. What will happen if there are no enough CPU, enough memory available in the cluster? Do you think your pods get scheduled? Pod goes to pending state. Even though it's a managed Kubernetes cluster, I have created a node group with min size as 2, max size as 5. Do you think will I get a third node automatically? Even though it's a managed Kubernetes cluster, do you think you will get a third node automatically here? No. Do I need someone who can act as a bridge between the Kubernetes and the cloud? Someone needs to identify the pods are in a pending state because of no CPU, no memory. Then it has to communicate with provider AWS to update the desired number. Do I need some kind of a application or some kind of a process who can look after the Kubernetes pods? If any pods are in a pending state, does that application or process needs to communicate with AWS to adjust the design numbers? Does that has to communicate with AWS auto scaling groups to adjust the design numbers? Yes. So that is what cluster autoscaler does. As of now, did I deploy any cluster autoscaler which can scale the cluster? No. Let me demonstrate that. Just to make things simple. Now, how much CPU, how much memory I am requesting for this pods? How much CPU, how much memory I am requesting for this pod container? How much CPU I am requesting? How much memory I am requesting? 500 millicore, 1 GB. Now, what is my total cluster capacity as of now? How many nodes I have total? As of now, how many nodes I have? 2 nodes. And what type of instance I have selected while creating that node group? T3 dot large. So what is the CPU? How much CPU? Each node? 2 CPU, 8 GB. 2 CPU, 8 GB. Now I have 2 replicas for that pod. Some other pod is also running, that is fine. I requested 2 pods. Now maximum how many pods, whether you are manually scaling, whether you are automatically scaling, based on this request, you are requesting this much. Now will I able to scale more than maybe 4 CPUs I will have total, and 16 GB I will have. Each I am requesting 500. Maybe will I able to scale more than 7 pods or 8 pods like that? Will I able to scale more than 7 or 8? Don't consider 8. If I have some other pods, other deployments also running, and other pods also requested some CPU memory, again, will it be like 7, 8? Can I go up to 7 or 8 also? No. If some other applications are running. Now, let me try to scale. I'm manually scaling. That scaling can happen using HPA also. I'm manually scaling something like this. I'm manually scaling maybe 5 pods. Let's see if that works. kubectl apply -f Java web app. Now you see the pods. Now, okay. Is it able to accommodate 5 pods? You can see in a running state, but health checks are getting performed. At least 5 pods, it is fine. Now let me see. Let me try to deploy maybe 7 pods or 8 pods now. The scaling can happen using HPA also. Now let's see. Now, do I have some pod in pending state? Do I have some pod in pending state? Here, if you see, it is not in a running state. It is in a pending state. Why it is in pending state? What could be the reason? When I describe my pod, I can see what is the reason why it is pending. What it is trying to say? Insufficient CPU, low on resources. We don't have enough resources. But am I getting third node automatically, even though I have a AWS that worker group, that node group is created as auto scaling group with minimum 2, maximum 5? Am I getting the third node or fourth node automatically? No. Why I am not getting third node or fourth node automatically? Do I need some process? Do I need someone to update the desired numbers in that group? Why it is not updating? I don't have anything here. But if I create auto scaling policies also, do you think it will work? If you create auto scaling policies based on the CPU like that, it will work? No, because you are just requesting. Do you think is it actually utilizing that much CPUs in those nodes? You are just reserving, you are requesting. But it is not really running out of CPU and memory. So auto scaling policies will not help here. So do I need some other way of identifying if any pods are in a pending state because of less resources? Then communicate with AWS to update the design numbers. Yes, that is what cluster autoscaler does. As of now, do I have any cluster autoscaler deployed in any namespace? Do I have a cluster autoscaler deployed in any namespace? Do I have anything called cluster autoscaler here? No. So that's why it is not working. Now we have a cluster autoscaler. Sometimes in the interviews also they'll ask what is difference between pod autoscaler and cluster autoscaler. What is cluster autoscaler basically? What is cluster autoscaler basically? So Kubernetes cluster autoscaler. Does that Kubernetes cluster autoscaler automatically able to adjust the size of the Kubernetes cluster? Does this Kubernetes cluster autoscaler, will it able to automatically adjust the size of the Kubernetes cluster nodes when one of the following conditions are true? When one of the following conditions are true. When this is going to adjust, there are pods that are failed to run in the cluster due to, it will scale the cluster in these conditions. When if any pods are failed to run in the cluster due to insufficient resources, which means if any pods are in a pending state because of insufficient resources, then is this cluster autoscaler can adjust the size of the cluster? Yes. What is the one more condition? There are nodes in the cluster that have been underutilized for some period. then their parts can be placed on the other existing nodes. Is it going to scale down the nodes also? Which means not only just increasing the nodes. If you have some servers, that servers are underutilized, then is it going to reduce the size of the cluster? Is it going to reduce the nodes in the cluster also? The way it is scaling, is it going to scale down also the size of the cluster? Yes. Now, can I use this cluster autoscaler in most of the providers like AWS, EKS clusters, Azure clusters, or GCP clusters also? Will I able to use this cluster autoscaler in managed Kubernetes like EKS, AKS, GKE also? You can use in any of the platform. Now you can deploy that cluster autoscaler. Now let me deploy that cluster autoscaler now. But when I am deploying the cluster autoscaler, does that cluster autoscaler requires AWS permissions because it has to communicate with AWS autoscaling APIs, because it has to get the current size, it has to update the desired size. Does that cluster autoscaler requires permissions also, AWS permissions to communicate with AWS APIs? Without having the permissions, if I deploy the cluster autoscaler, do you think will it able to make API calls? Will it able to communicate with autoscaling group APIs in AWS? No. Then how can I grant the permissions? EKS cluster autoscaler. Now I want to deploy a cluster autoscaler in EKS. Now, if I go here, they're explaining what is cluster autoscaler, which I have already explained. Now you need one Kubernetes cluster, you need a node group. So prerequisites. Before you are deploying a cluster autoscaler, you must have the following prerequisites. Do I need to have one EKS cluster already if I want to deploy? Yes, I already have a EKS cluster. And the node groups, the node groups with autoscaling tags. I already have a node group. I already have a node group. But is that node group should have these tags also, AWS tags? Because that cluster autoscaler will use these tags internally. If you see, when I go to my Kubernetes node group, when I go to my Kubernetes node group, that EKS node group, when I go to that EKS node group or EKS nodes also, let me go to that EKS node group. So this is my EKS cluster. I have one node group here, this node group here. If you see this node group, right? Let me click on this node group. This node group has some tags also. This node group has some tags also. Is that node group here? Maybe you can go to the auto scaling group if it is not showing here. Let me go to that auto scaling group. That node group is created as a auto scaling group also. Now let me go to that auto scaling group. Let me go to that auto scaling group. That node group is basically one auto scaling group. If I go to this auto scaling group, now if you scroll down, you can see some tags also. Now if you see, already do we have those tags, whatever is required as a prerequisite to set up cluster autoscaler, whatever is required as a prerequisite to set up the cluster autoscaler, I need to have this as a key, k-test.io.cluster-autoscaler, my cluster name. This is my cluster name, value should be owned, cluster autoscaler should be enabled. Do I have all these things already added while creating a node group itself? While creating a node group itself, these got automatically added. Now that prerequisite also met. Then what is the next one? Do I need some kind of a permissions to adjust the desired capacity? Now do I need kind of a auto scaling permissions? Do I need some kind of auto scaling permissions? Otherwise, the scaling will not happen. Now I need this set desired capacity permissions in auto scaling, terminate instances in auto scaling group, because it will increase the servers and it will terminate the servers. Now, do I need these permissions for cluster autoscaler? Yes. Now, cluster autoscaler also will be running as a pod. Cluster autoscaler also will be running as a pod in my Kubernetes cluster. Now, is it possible to grant the permissions to that pod basically by attaching permissions to the role, which is already used in my node group? If you remember, while creating a node group, did I attach one IAM role to that node group? Did I attach one IAM role to the node group, that servers? Can I attach this policy also to the same role? Can I attach this policy also to the same role where the pod, that cluster autoscaler pods gets created? The cluster autoscaler pod also will be running as a container in my Kubernetes. If I have this role attached to that server, that cluster autoscaler is running in that server, does that cluster autoscaler will be able to communicate with AWS APIs? Yes. So I'll create a policy with this JSON. I'll create a policy with this JSON. But here you need to update your cluster name like this. You need to update your cluster name like this. If you are taking this YML, you need to update your cluster name here. Instead of this, you need to update your cluster name. Otherwise, I will share one more YML with you guys. You can attach that one also. Something like this. You can use this one, whatever I'm going to share in a running notes, only this statement. Or if you want to take this one, make sure you are updating your cluster name here. So what is my cluster name? Whatever I have used here, like this one, ek-demo, that is my cluster name. So let's take this one. I'm going to take this one. So will I create, first I'll create a policy, IAM policy. I'll go to IAM. Can I consider this as a customer managed policy instead of AWS managed policy? Since I am creating a policy, can I consider this as a customer managed policy in AWS instead of AWS managed policy? Yes. So let me go to policies. Let me create one policy here. I can give any name. Service. This one, if you want to create using UI, you can use this one. Since I already have a JSON, can I go to this JSON option? Can I copy paste that JSON? I already have a policy JSON. I can go to this JSON option. I can copy paste this JSON with required policies, auto scaling policies. Click on next. I will give some name. Here. EKS cluster auto scalar policy, like this. Some name. I'll create a policy. Now this policy, can I attach to the IAM role which is already used in that node group? Can I attach this policy to the IAM role which is already used in that node group? Because here we are already using one IAM role. To that node group. So I will go to that IAM role. Whatever role we already used. I'll go to the roles. Here, this one, EKS, what is that role? Let me search. EKS worker role. EKS worker role. Is this role is used with your auto scaling that node group when I created a node group? This one. If you have a confusion, you can go to that EKS cluster. You can go to that EKS cluster. You can go to this EKS cluster. You can go to the configuration, compute. You click on this node group. If you click on this node group, now is this node group is using this IAM role? IAM role. If you click on this IAM role also, you will go to that IAM page. Now I'll attach that. I'll go to this role, worker role. I'll go to this role. I'll go to the permissions, add permissions, attach policies, attach policy. Now, can I attach this policy, whatever policy I created, EKS cluster auto scalar policy with these required permissions? Can I attach that policy to this role? Yes. After attaching this, can I deploy my autoscaler, that YML? That autoscaler is also kind of one YML. If you see, this is the YML, kind of a deployment. So this is the URL they have given. You are, curl-o. You are downloading that YML. Now this is the YML. Let me open. Now if you see, is that cluster autoscaler is getting deployed as a deployment again? This cluster autoscaler image, that application, that cluster autoscaler application is again getting deployed as a deployment using this image. Now it is creating some roles also, because does this cluster autoscaler has to communicate with Kubernetes APIs also to see how many pods are there, how many pods are in a pending state? Does this cluster autoscaler requires permissions to the Kubernetes APIs also, not only just AWS APIs? Now, how we are granting permissions to the AWS APIs here for that cluster autoscaler application? Are we using a concept of RBAC, like service account we are creating? We are creating a role. Here, are we granting permissions to pods? We are giving a permissions to pods, nodes, required permissions to the pods, controllers, and all these things we are granting. This cluster role is associated with that cluster service account here. Service account here. This service account is using by your pod container. If you see, your pod is attaching with that service account. So this way, is this container will able to access Kubernetes APIs also because of the permissions we are attaching here. It has access to the Kubernetes APIs as well as AWS APIs. Now, if I deploy this cluster autoscaler, will it able to communicate with Kubernetes APIs to identify whether any pods are in a pending state because of low resources? At the same time, is that cluster autoscaler will be able to communicate with AWS APIs also to update the desired capacities, terminate the desired servers in that if there are less load? Yes. But before deploying this, can I deploy as is without modifying few values here? Do I need to modify my cluster name here? What is the name of the cluster? You need to modify. Now, what you can do, as per the installation instructions they have given, you get that YML. They are saying modify a YML and replace this one with your cluster name. Then you apply. Like this. Now, along with that one, you can update the region also, in which region you want to have. Now I am giving that YML here, guys. I'm giving that YML here itself. Before you apply as is, do you need to replace here what is your cluster name and in which region your cluster? Do you need to replace these two places? Yes. Now let me give this one. Let me create like this. I'm creating one YML like this, cluster autoscalar dot YML. So I am having all these things, but I'll make sure these are updated. Region is correct. Now what is my cluster name? Is this cluster name correct? It is not underscore, I think now. It is not underscore, I think now. It is what? Hyphen. It is hyphen. Something like this. Now let me deploy. But this is also deployed as a pod, as a container. But since I'm requesting less CPU, less memory, is that cluster autoscalar pods get created? I'm just requesting 100 millicore, 300 megabytes for this one. So it may deploy. Now let me deploy a cluster autoscalar. Now if you see, do I have one application called cluster autoscalar, one pod called cluster autoscalar getting created in a kube system namespace? If you observe now, how many nodes I have? How many nodes I have as of now? Only two. Do I have some parts in a pending state? Do I have some parts in a pending state now? If you see, do I have some part in a pending state? Now I am deploying this cluster autoscalar. I am deploying this cluster autoscalar. Now cluster autoscalar is running. Cluster autoscalar is running. Now if I see the logs of the cluster autoscalar, if I see the logs of the cluster autoscalar, this is one application. This is one application. Now if you see, is it able to identify already? Is that cluster autoscalar application, is it able to identify one pod is unschedulable? Is it able to identify one pod is unschedulable? And is it saying upcoming one node? Is it saying upcoming one node? This is one application basically. This is one application, but is it our own application? Is it application for end users? Is it an application for end users? No. It is like kind of one Kubernetes internal application. If you observe, is it developed using some programmatic language? Is it developed using some programmatic language? What programmatic language they have used to develop that cluster autoscalar? Golang. Go language. Using that Go language, are they making API calls internally to the Kubernetes API server to identify the pod details? And also, is it making AWS APIs internally to adjust the desired capacities? Now, because of that, now when I see kubectl get pods, now do you see whatever pod which was in a pending state, now is it showing like a container creating, which means is that pod got scheduled to some node? Is that pod got scheduled to some node? Now when I see kubectl get nodes, kubectl get nodes, can I see three nodes now? 72 seconds ago, I got one more node. Now is that pod, whatever pod which was in a pending state, is that pod got scheduled to that node? Is that pod got scheduled to that node, this node, 225, this one, in that new node? Now, what exactly happened, as I told, is that cluster autoscalar communicated with your AWS autoscaling group. Is it updated this desired capacities? If I go and refresh here completely, if I go and refresh here completely, whole page I am refreshing here. Now can I see three servers and the desired capacity of that node group? Somehow it is not reflecting here. But let me go to auto scaling group. Let me go to auto scaling group. Let me go to auto scaling group. Let me go to auto scaling group here. Now can I see desired capacity is 3, current is 3. Who updated this desired capacity here? Who updated this desired capacity? Is that cluster autoscaler updated this desired capacity? On which basis it is calculating? Krishna Prasad is asking on which basis it is calculating. You have to tell now. On which basis it is calculating? Is it calculating based on the parts which are in a pending state, and how many parts are in a pending state, and how much CPU, how much memory you are requesting? If I create one server, will it able to accommodate those many parts, or do I need to create a two parts? Based on that, some algorithm is happening in that cluster autoscaler application. Is it calculating how many parts are in a pending state, and to accommodate those parts, how many nodes we need to adjust? Is it calculating some kind of algorithm in that cluster autoscaler? Yes, that is what happening. Now I have a 3 nodes. My parts are in a running state. Now let me try to scale, whether you are manually scaling, whether you are automatically scaling, that doesn't matter. Now let me scale it to maybe 10 servers, 10 pods. Let me again apply that YML. Let me again apply that YML. Now again, if you see, again do I have some parts are in a pending state. Sorry, I have not applied that YML. I have applied a different YML. Let me apply. kubectl apply that YML I am applying. Now if you see, again do I have some parts in pending state. It is able to accommodate one pod, it is able to accommodate another pod also. But again do I have one pod which is in pending state, again this one. Now again, is that cluster autoscaler again able to identify the parts, are some parts are in pending state? Again is it able to identify this pod, kubectl get pods? If you see, is it able to identify this pod is in unschedulable state, this pod ending with the 7FB? Now is it again saying upcoming one node? Because if it bring up one node, that pod can be accommodated in that node. Now can I see 4 nodes again? When I execute kubectl nodes, can I see 4 nodes now? Just now that node got created. That node will be ready in some time. Once that node is ready, whatever pod which was in a pending state, whatever pod is in a pending state, is that pod get scheduled to that node once that node is ready? Once that node is ready? Yes. But even though I keep deploying lot of applications, if it is running out of resources, will it able to create more than 5 nodes? Will it able to create more than 5 nodes? If I keep deploying, let's say QE, let's say Java web app. Now let's say I'm saying 15 servers. I mean to say 15 replicas. I'm manually scaling. Let's say I'm saying 15 replicas or 18 replicas, like that. Now it is able to accommodate. Now the pod is also running whatever it was in pending. Now I have total 4 nodes. Now I am trying to scale more. I will get another node, but will it able to get a 6th node, 7th node also, even though some parts are in a pending state? Now I am trying to scale lot of pods. Now again you see, now some parts are in pending state. Let me see kubectl get pods grep. Let me grep with pending. Now do I have some parts are in pending state as of now? These many parts are in pending state. Now as of now 4 nodes is there. Will it able to create another node? Now when I see the logs again, it will say these many parts are in a pending state. It will identify these many parts are in a pending state. If you see the logs, right? It will identify a lot of pods are in pending state. Is it able to identify these many pods are in pending state? Now it is saying upcoming one node, upcoming one node, only one node. But is it, do you see a message saying that, do you see a message saying that max size is reached, max size is reached? Because what is the max size I have given for that scaling, that group, node group? 5. Now I will get only one node. Whatever parts can be accommodated in that node, those parts gets accommodated. But do I still have 3 parts in a pending state? Do I still have 3 parts in a pending state? Will I get, does those parts get scheduled to any node now? No, because we already reached max. So this way, will I able to scale up my cluster also by using cluster auto scaler? Whenever any parts are in a pending state, will I able to increase the number of nodes? Will I able to decrease the number of nodes also? The way we are scaling the pods, can I scale the nodes also using this cluster auto scaler? This way, is your Kubernetes cluster also gets auto scaled, adjusted based on the requirements, based on the applications which you are deploying? Yes, that is how it works. Now let me scale down. If I remove lot of applications, I am not deploying lot of applications, or I am scaling down my pods, does these nodes also gets terminated after some time? Does this nodes also gets terminated if you don't deploy any pods to that nodes? Any pods you are not deploying, any application is not getting deployed in these nodes after some cooldown period. After some cooldown period, is that additional nodes also gets terminated? Whatever nodes is created? Yes. So I am again scaling down my pod. I have only less pods now. Lot of pods are getting terminated. Now, is this nodes gets terminated after some time? Is this nodes also get adjusted? Maybe whatever nodes, how many nodes it really need, it will keep those many nodes. It will terminate other nodes. Nothing called rolling update here. I am talking about node. So there is nothing called rolling update. I am not updating any deployment here. I am just increasing, decreasing the nodes, number of pods. So now, instead of having those many pods, I have only less pods for that application. Only 2 pods are there. Now these pods are running in these 2 nodes. If none of the applications get deployed in other nodes, if none of the applications got deployed in these other nodes, does cluster autoscaler will again reduce the desired size in that node group? Once it is reduced the desired size, is it going to terminate those servers where we don't have any pods running? Where we don't have any pods running, is that nodes gets terminated? Yes. So this is how cluster autoscaler works. This is how cluster autoscaler works. Is everyone clear what is cluster autoscaler and how it works? What is the difference between cluster autoscaler and pod autoscaler? Is everyone clear? Now, will I able to achieve this cluster autoscaler if I am using a self-managed Kubernetes clusters or bare metal Kubernetes clusters? Cluster autoscaler? No. But is it possible to achieve pod autoscaler even though I am using bare metal or self-managed? Yes. Now, what is the one more advantage here? Do I have some storage classes configured by default? Do I already have one storage class here in this cluster? What is the storage class I have here? What provisioner? What provisioner is that? What provisioner is that? EBS GP2 values. And is that provisioner, is that storage class marked as a default? Yes. Now, if I want to deploy any application, like stateful application, like a stateful set also, if I try to deploy any application like a stateful set also like this, now is volumes gets created? Now this is my stateful set. I want to create in some namespace called test. As of now, I don't have a test namespace. I'll create a namespace also. Kubectl apply hyphen f. Sorry, there is no YML, right? Kubectl create ns. Namespace name is just a test. Now, do I have a namespace called test here? As of now, nothing is running in that namespace. Now, let me apply. Now, if you see in that namespace, I created a stateful set. It is going to create one after the other. In the background, am I getting volumes also? Who is creating these volumes? What type of volumes are getting created now? I have a PVC is also getting created because it's a stateful set. PVC is also getting created and a PV also getting created. Now when I go to AWS, can I see when I go to AWS volumes, EBS volumes, can I see some volumes getting created here? And is those volumes is attached with your pods, your containers? Now can I see this volume, Kubernetes dynamic PV type GB2, 1 GB capacity created today at 9:26. It is attached with that server. Where my pod is running, where my Kubernetes pod is running. Since I created a stateful set with 3 replicas, am I getting multiple volumes one after the other? You can see I'll get multiple values because I'm using a stateful set. Now I have 2 pods, 2 PVs and 2 PVCs. It will create one after the other. But once this is ready, can I set up that kind of a ripple set or whatever that MongoDB ripple set, primary, secondary kind of a configuration, whatever way you have done? Once these pods are ready, I can go to one of the database pod the way I have done, like kubectl exec -it. I can go inside this -n test namespace -bash rsh. Now, if you see host name, we discussed all these things, a stateful set concept. This is the host name, stable unique network identifiers and the stable values. Now I'll connect to Mongo shell. By executing Mongo. Here can I execute these commands? But make sure your namespaces are correctly used. As of now, what is my namespace? Just a test. It is not a test-ns. So can I execute like this? Now if you see rs.status, the repel set status, the database command, rs.status, the database repel set. Now do I have these members? Like out of this one is primary, this one is primary, other 2 are secondary. Now I'll create something like this, the database root username and password. Once this is done, let me come out of this. Now my database is running as a cluster within my Kubernetes cluster using stateful set. Now can I deploy my application? Can I deploy that application, Spring application here? Whether you are using config map, secrets and all these things, that doesn't matter. As of now, I am hard coding like this. But this time, can I create a service of type load balancer to access this one from outside? Now, the best practices. Can I define liveness probe, readiness probe also? Liveness probe, readiness probe also for this application if I want to check the health of the application? Yes. Now let me apply this. Now is this application is using this service name internally to communicate with your database pods? Now database should be accessible within the cluster. I don't want this database to be exposed to the outside. So that's why what type of service we created? Again, it says stateful set. What type of service we created? Is it a cluster IP service or headless service? Is it a cluster IP service or headless service? If you see cluster IP none, cluster IP none. What type of service it is? Headless. Now you see, now my database pod is running, my application pods also running. I got a load balancer for my application. Now can I use this load balancer to access that front end application, that stateless application, once this is ready? If you see, as of now, let's see how many nodes I have. If it is running out of nodes, does that cluster autoscaler, already we have additional nodes, right? 5 nodes are still there. So some pods are running in these nodes also. Some of the pods are running in these nodes also. So pods got scheduled in these nodes. In whatever nodes we don't have any pods, after some cooldown period, does those pods gets removed also by that cluster autoscaler? Yes. That is, each one do its job. Now I am able to access this application, but load balancer is not completely ready. This load balancer is getting created for the other application. The load balancer is getting created for other application. I am getting one more load balancer for that other application. Now, yeah, this one. Now I am able to access this one. Is this application load balance? Is this request is going to that load balancer? Is load balancer is routing the traffic to nodes, nodes to that Kubernetes service, service to your Spring application pods? And is that Spring application pods are communicating with the database? That stateful set, our database also running as a cluster within the Kubernetes? Yes. So this way it is working. Now if required, I don't want to use this name. Can I go and map this name, load balancer, with some domain name in Route 53? I can go to this. I go to this. I go to this hosted zone. I'll create a record, a record. Let's say if anyone is accessing like this, spring app.mithuntechdevops.co.in, can I route the traffic to that load balancer, which is classic load balancer in Mumbai region? That one, whatever, you need to select the correct one. What is that? A170. A170, this one. Now, if anyone access like this, springapp.mithuntechdevops.co.in, is that domain resolved to that IP of that load balancer? Request goes to that load balancer to node, node to pod. It will take some time. Spring app.mithuntech, that is missing. Now request is going to load balancer to the node to pod. But since my application is running on root context itself, now can I see without giving any context path also, because my application is running on the root context itself, am I able to access this application like this? Now do you guys also able to access this application? Now what happened? I need to see my database. Some kind of a adjustment has happened here. That cluster autoscaler or something went wrong with my database pods. Some kind of adjustment is happening here. That cluster autoscaler thinks that you really need those many nodes. You don't really need those many nodes. Is it adjusted nodes? Is it remove some additional nodes and these parts are getting adjusted to new nodes also? If you see, is your database parts are getting adjusted to new nodes? If you see here, yes. So it has terminated some additional nodes. Now, since I am using stateful set with the EBS values, even though parts are getting deleted, do I have a data loss here? Now, will you guys able to relate end to end how it is happening? Now, if I have a CI/CD pipelines for each of these applications, whatever I have deployed in this cluster, suppose I have a CI/CD pipelines for this Python application, I have a CI/CD pipeline for this Java application. If I have a CI/CD pipeline for this application also, then will I able to continuously integrate and apply also in this without downtime also if required? In the other side, end users are accessing like this. In the other side, end users are accessing like this. You can do that. If you don't have a confidence on this rolling updates, will you able to do like a complete downtime deployments or a blue-green deployments or canary deployments also? Yes, this is how it works. Now, one more important concept here. If I have to deploy hundreds of applications in my Kubernetes cluster, is it a good idea to have hundreds of load balancers? Because for each application, whenever I am creating a service of type load balancer, am I getting one external load balancer for each application? Now I just deployed 3 microservices. Do I have a 3 load balancers created? But if I have to deploy hundreds of applications, is it a best practice or is it good to have a hundreds of load balancers for each application, one load balancer external? No. Then how can I control the traffic within Kubernetes cluster with single external load balancer? I want to have only one external load balancer, but I want to control traffic, how traffic should be routed to your Kubernetes services from external traffic, how external traffic should be routed to Kubernetes services within the cluster with single load balancer. That is where we have a one more concept. That is where we have a one more concept called ingress controller. Ingress controller and ingress resource. Ingress resource. This ingress controller and this ingress resource is different. Don't consider this ingress as a network policy ingress. Don't consider this ingress as a network policy ingress. This is altogether a different topic. Using this ingress controller with single load balancer from external traffic with single external load balancer, will I able to route the traffic to Kubernetes services, different Kubernetes services within the Kubernetes cluster, kind of a host based routing, path based routing to Kubernetes services. Host based routing to Kubernetes service, path based routing to Kubernetes service within the Kubernetes cluster with the help of one ingress controller with single external load balancer. Yes. So this I will continue in the next class. This I will continue in the next class. The next class is on Monday. So we will discuss about what is ingress controller, what is that ingress resource, how to create ingress resource, all these things we will discuss. But meantime, that video is already uploaded in our YouTube channel. In the meantime, the video is already uploaded in our YouTube channel. If you get some time, try to go through this video so that you can understand more easily. This one, Kubernetes ingress controller and ingress resource. But here I am using a Kubernetes cluster which is created using kops. In this video I have used Kubernetes cluster which is created using kops. But whether it's a kops cluster, whether it's a EKS cluster, whether it's a AKS, GKS, is this ingress controller and ingress concepts will be different? Again, no. The concept remains same. Go through this video. I will explain this ingress controller and ingress resource in the next class. And if you don't have the CI/CD already practiced, Instead of you are manually deploying like this, you are manually deploying like this, will you able to do this using CI/CD pipelines in each microservice repository? In the each microservice repository, can you have a Jenkins file? Do you have a Docker file? Can you have a Kubernetes files also? Whatever Kubernetes objects you want to create for that application, you can have and apply. If that is not practiced, try to practice that one also. The more you practice, the more you attend the classes, the more you practice, the more you go through these videos, you can understand end to end. Are you going to work in a similar infrastructure, kind of a similar environment in your actual projects also? But there, the volumes, I mean to say, the size of the servers will be very huge. The number of servers, you will have lot of servers. The number of basically applications will be more. The lines of code also very high. Except that, do you have all these concepts remain same? CI/CD, Docker, Kubernetes. Yes. The more you practice, the more you can manage your work and your interviews also. You don't need any proxy, any support, because we are trying to cover all these use cases. Whatever we need to use in the actual environments, we are covering all the use cases. Use cases are nothing but requirements. So whatever fits for your requirement, your use case, you need to implement that. Okay. Thank you guys. That's it for today. I'll continue next week. Now, the next week, I mean to say, by Friday or by Saturday, your course will be also completed and Kubernetes also completed. So maybe by Friday or max Saturday, the Kubernetes as well as your course is also done. If you need one interactive session at the end of the course, anytime you can ask. Now, if you want to ask some question, now itself you can ask Krishna Prasad. Nothing like a separate session for if you want to interact. Now, if you want to interact, you can unmute and you can ask any question now itself.
Yes, sir. My intention regarding this is like whenever we go for interviews, they're asking about your current environment, like how you set up. So, like, can you please explain any one of them? Like, it would be helpful for us. Like conceptually, we can
Environment in the
conceptually we can
environment in
explain.
the
Yeah,
yeah, just like environment is nothing but your infrastructure, right? How you are setting up the infrastructure. If I am using virtualized environment, not containerized environments, do I need to have application servers where I can install Tomcat and apply the application? I need to have application servers where I need to set up applications, softwares, configuration, and all those things. If you are using cloud, instead of manually creating an infrastructure or that environment, can I automate that using Terraform? I will have a separate code, separate repositories where I will have only infrastructure code. Using that infrastructure as a code, if I run that code, is that infrastructure will be created using the Terraform? Yes.
Yes,
But is that infrastructure will be like every day you are going to run that pipelines, infrastructure pipelines, the way you are running the pipelines for your applications, is that infrastructure pipelines will be executed every day? No.
yes,
You are not going to change your infrastructure very frequently, right? The way you are going to change your applications, you are not going to change the infrastructure. But if any additional servers is required, if any additional resources are required, can I modify that infrastructure as a code and run one more time?
yes. Based upon
That
that, they are
is,
asking your day-to-day activities.
yeah,
Based upon
that is your infrastructure as a code. But once that infrastructure is in place, can I have my application pipelines in place, like application CI/CD? Whatever developers are developing the applications, can I have a separate source code repositories for that applications, build scripts, Docker files? If you are using Kubernetes, Kubernetes manifest files as a separate application repository. If for that application repository, can I write a pipelines? That pipelines will connect to the infrastructure which you have created to deploy. So infrastructure is basically one thing. Application deployment is another thing. But application deployment, is it like a frequent changes? Like frequent changes, developers will keep modifying the application code when they are actually developing. So do we need to support any new application, any new microservice comes into picture? Do we need to support that application team to onboard that application, like creating a Docker files if the application teams are not familiar, creating a namespaces based on their resource request and limits in the Kubernetes, creating volumes based
Like
on their
here we are,
requirement. And
yes,
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 good.
sorry. We are using like cloud formation templates, right? In case they will ask, you are using Terraform or not, like which one you are using like daily, like for creating
That which one is
infrastructure.
comfortable? That which
Okay,
one you are comfortable, your
okay,
project is using. Now
okay.
we are teaching Jenkins here, but is Jenkins is the only CI/CD tool in the market? No,
No,
right?
no, no. Hudson we can.
There are plenty of CI/CD tools available. Some projects might be using Bamboo, some projects might be using GitLab, but does the concept of CI, does the concept of CD will be different? No. But the way we are going to write pipelines will be different. In Jenkins, we are going to use Groovy, that declarative or scripted, it's kind of a Groovy scripting. But if I go for Azure DevOps, if I go for a GitLab, our pipelines in the form of YML files again. But in the background, is that Azure DevOps or is that GitLab has a capabilities to create a agents, run those steps, whatever you are giving in a YML format? Yes. So CI/CD will not be different, but the way we are going to use the tool is different. So there are plenty of tools available in the market in DevOps. So, but category is important. Like you need to be familiar with each category. CI/CD one tool. If projects are using different tool, will it be difficult for you to adapt the new tool in the same category?
Need to know
No.
the terminology.
Terminologies. That's what important. But if you want to learn all the DevOps tools, whatever available in the market, even 5 years also not sufficient. So
Entire life.
entire life is also not sufficient, correct? So based on the requirements, you need to keep adapting. If you ask me, when I moved to DevOps almost 6-7 years back, I started with the Jenkins, but later I switched companies. I switched to different projects also within the company. I started working on Azure. I started working on Google Cloud. I started working on AWS on-prem, and again like a GitLab, Azure DevOps, Jenkins, Spinnaker. Based on the projects, they may use different tools, but you should be ready to accept that changes, and you should be ready to learn and work. Otherwise, your career will be stagnant and you will not have any growth also.
Sir, if they
Nowadays,
ask you about, if they ask about Python and Terraform, like we should say like we didn't get a chance to work on that like that, right? We are ready
yes,
to
yes,
learn and we just didn't get a chance to work.
yes,
Okay.
yes, 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 correct. As I already told guys many times, you are not the only one. You are not the superhero in your project. Like you, there are a lot of members. Each one will work in one area. If you got an opportunity to work on Terraform, you will become an expert in Terraform. If you don't got an opportunity to work in Terraform, if you are got the opportunity to work in only like Jenkins, like Kubernetes and all these things, your primary focus is only on that tool. It no need to be like always you say yes, 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 or whatever tools. But even though you are not working, but you should have a basics like what is Terraform, what is resource block, what is provider, some kind of a basics, right? So you can say I didn't got an opportunity to work on Terraform, but I know I have explored myself, I know all these things. Provided a chance, I can start working on it. That's it. Any other questions? If you want to ask, feel free to ask. Then thank you guys. Have a great weekend. Try to practice. Now you are all set to ready to put your resumes and start looking for a job. You can prepare your resumes and upload in portals like Naukri, LinkedIn, all those things, and try to appear for interviews. Easily you can crack. if you understood, if you practice all these classes, whatever we are discussing from last 4.5 to 5 months. Thank you guys. We'll see you on Monday.